And welcome to the actual official beginning of Building a Better Villain, presented by me, Captain Mike. I am Captain Mike. Oh, this is great. I haven't even done anything yet. All right. Nope. There we go. I always feel like it is important that if somebody is going to spend an hour talking about something, you should know a little something about them. My name is Captain Mike Clegg. Those are my stats. I started playing Dungeons & Dragons years ago. But it was my first role-playing game, and so I always think of myself as having those 6 stats. My class is presenter and teacher. I do have an MA in writing, a BA in English, 30-something years of role-playing, so you can do the math on that one. And I'm also a teacher. Specifically, I'm an English teacher and a history teacher, which you may have picked up on already and may pick up on as well in the future. So let's talk about some villainy, yeah? What I want to get at in this is how to build a better villain. What makes a villain, what makes them memorable, what makes them interesting, what makes them a fun part of a game or an interesting part of a story. And while I do plan on talking about most of this from the perspective of role-playing games and game mastering and so forth, it's as applicable if you're writing a movie script or a book or anything like that. So the essentials of a villain, they have to have a motivation. They have to be a credible threat. Otherwise, they're not a villain. They're just something that happens. They're a side character. They need a good modus operandi, is some sort of a connection. And they have to be, if not technically beatable, at least something that the heroes can go against. Because otherwise, they're really more of a force of nature. You know, if you don't go out and fight a blizzard, you endure a blizzard. For low-level characters, you don't go out and beat a dragon, you endure, and in many cases, run away from a dragon. But it just wouldn't be one of my shows without this panel. First and foremost, everything I say, of course, is just advice and my own personal observations and opinions, but what is key to anything is to know your audience. And I feel like this is very important when we're talking about villains, because bad guys are bad. And the people that you're playing with may have different thresholds of badness that they're willing to put up with in their enjoyment time. Now, I had mentioned earlier House of the Dragon, pretty vicious stuff. You might not have a group of people who are willing to put up with that kind of horrific stuff, or who just even want to hear about it, or even have it alluded to. So knowing your audience is very key. Your audience might be more along the lines of My Little Pony. And they're just looking for villains who are like, oh, we're going to get you, and in some non-specific fashion, we hate your friendship. You know, or like Gargamel, who is going to like capture the Smurfs for some reason.
He wanted to eat them.
And sometimes he wants to eat them, but other times he wants to make like a potion out of them, and other times he just seems like he's just annoyed because they keep tricking him. And
Potion's just another way to
a potion. You're in advertising, aren't you? A potion. It's just another way to eat something. All right, and welcome. We do have some, I think, scattered chairs if you feel like having a seat, but far be it for me to tell somebody to do something. That having been said, I'm going to tell you how to do stuff. All right, so let's start with what makes a villain even get up in the morning, which for most of us is probably a good question in the first place. But villains must have a motivation. There has to be something that drives them to villainy, otherwise they just come off as being cartoonish, Gargamel-like, to continue that. You know, if there isn't a reason for them to be a villain, then they're not really a villain. They're just someone with a hobby. Maybe not even that. But the motivations for villainy are actually, I think, very accessible, and that's key, right? That's what makes villains so compelling, is that there's always that idea of like, ooh, there but for the grace of God, there but for the thin veneer of self-control, there but for my lack of laser beam eyes. So the villains, their motivation may be something as simple or complicated as revenge. Of course, revenge villains, there are many. Actually, most of the Marvel villains, I feel, are coming down to revenge. Any Marvel movie with a 2 in it, the villain involves revenge. And it doesn't have to be revenge necessarily against someone in particular. Killmonger was an example that someone had brought up. Thank you very much. Killmonger is, in fact, a great example of someone who's going after sort of a non-specific revenge, even though he wants power and he wants his place on the throne. What he really wants is to get back at the people who made him feel separate. What he wants is to undo what he believes are the wrongs. And so, revenge. Villains, there's an old saying, everyone is the hero of their own story. And certainly villains also believe that. No one goes into villainy like, yes, I'm the bad guy, and they're going to defeat the heck out of me. Well, but you have this idea that they're the heroes. So if they're looking for revenge, it is the just desserts. It's what they deserve, right? It's what they want to mete out the justice that they feel other people deserve and aren't getting. And going along with revenge, there's the chip on the shoulder. There's just that villain who's like, the world gave me a raw deal and nobody gives me a... No, that was Arnold Schwarzenegger. But indeed, that idea that it's like, things were terrible for me, so I'm going to make things terrible for everyone else. Oftentimes this goes with someone who is down on their luck. Oftentimes they themselves have created their own mess, but don't see it. And then they gain some sort of incredible power. And it's like, now I'm in charge. Boo me off of the stage at improv night. That's a Futurama reference. I haven't been booed off the stage at improv night. Money. What could be more classic, right? Villainy. Superhero villainy often seems to start this way. You get the bank heist. You get we've got this, we just need cash. And sometimes this can be a very understandable sort of a thing where sometimes people just need money, and then they steal the money and that makes them a villain. And then that then can process further into things like the chip on the shoulder or the revenge. Because, if I'm poor and I steal money, that makes me the bad person, but I stole it to feed people and now I'm being attacked by these superheroes and all I wanted to do was feed my family, so I've constructed a death trap to grind them into butter. Sorry, was that too specific? I can't believe it's not butter. We're back to the Smurf plot. I didn't mean it. Oh, please may Smurfs not be my guiding light. And indeed, and you may notice that even as we're going through these motivations, there is that feeling where a lot of times there's that very reasonable start. And there's a meme that has gone around for the past years. The guy pouring a drink and he's like, when the villain starts talking about his plan, he's low-key making a lot of sense. Indeed, the villains should make sense. Their motivations should be reasonable. What makes them villains isn't usually that their motivations are so terrible. It's that their methods, their end result, or they're so willing to overplay that hand that makes them terrible. Killmonger, another great example. He makes a lot of sense when he starts talking, but then he's like, and so I'm going to kill everybody. And then everyone's like, you were this close to being an Avenger. And indeed, misguided altruism is a classic example of someone who's like, it's like they're doing everything right, and then at the end it's like, so I built an A-bomb. It's like, yes?
So I'm going to try to talk around spoilers for this. But
Cool.
There was a series, it's for everyone who knows JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
There's one part that has a villain in it, who the main character says to him at the very end in the final fight, I believe in what you're doing, and I would support it full ahead. But everything that you've done to this point, you gotta go.
Yeah.
And then dispatches him in one of the most brutal manners I've ever seen in fiction.
Of course, it's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But yes, and exactly, and oftentimes we don't get that kind of like incredibly direct quote, but we do have that. So yeah, it's always about that like, okay, yeah, I see where you're coming from, but did you have to do it like this? And indeed, depending on the nature of your game or the nature of the movie or the nature of whatever you're making, that may be a major point where, well, what made this person a villain? Why is it that they made them the villain, but then made these people the hero? I mean, Iron Man killed a lot of people, and then he went on to kill more people, but it's cool because he was the hero. you can kind of see how it's very easy to be like, well, what makes him the hero and not the other guy? Yes?
Question.
Sure.
How do you feel about the motivation of boredom?
Motivation of boredom.
Literally, I'm bored and I want to watch the world burn.
Yes, that is entirely fine. That's and more. And indeed, and that can be a lot of fun. I am not a huge fan of the idea of like, I'm so crazy, I do crazy things. One, I feel that it really, undercuts the very concept of like mental health issues and that sort of thing. But also from a narrative stance, it is weak and flimsy because there are so many ways that people become eccentric or start to lose it. Megalomania is a very classic one, the idea like no one is as powerful as I am, which is of course classic, and so you have to set out to prove that no one else is as powerful as you are. But boredom, the desire for fun. The Joker is a classic example, but I think in this case, a great example for this one specifically is the Lego Batman Joker. A weird series of words all put in a row, but becoming more normal all the time. Indeed, he's just looking to have a good time. He wants to have fun. And these characters can be very interesting because that then, the ultimate purpose for the heroes for having a motivation is that there's something to play off of. And it makes them more interesting. So if you're looking for someone who's intending to have fun, well then, once it becomes boring, they're going to stop whatever it is because it's boring. There's no longer any point to it. Conversely, they become hard to predict because you have to consider what they think of as fun. Motivations are very valuable because they can form the framework of how your villain is going to approach whatever villainy they do, whatever it is that they try to have. You mentioned fun. There was a villain that I had. She was a robot named Dissects, and her original purpose was to play games. She was designed to be a player too, the video game player, and the person who had commissioned the supervillain who had commissioned her, got distracted and basically she wandered off on her own. But her MO, which we'll get to later, was that she was still programmed to play games. So she would play games, but her idea of fun included things like, putting people in peril, the occasional, accidental death. What's that? Saw traps. Well, it wasn't that intense, but but saw traps. But that meant that the players knew, well, she follows rules because she'll make up, even though she makes up the games still have rules, and it still has to follow the game purpose. So that if they could figure a way around the rules, or if they could, complete the game, then the game was over. And she was just like, okay. I mean, that's not like a great ending to the arc, just like when the villain's like, okay. But it meant that there were ways to kind of like trap her from within. Any other questions on motivation? Oh, I missed power. Power, do I really need to go over power? I mean, how classic is that? Once you have power, of course, the next thing you do is you get more power. Villains must pose a credible threat. Now, there are lots of types of credible threat, but there has to be something that the villain can do. There has to be something that makes the players, or makes the heroes, or makes the reader, just like, ooh, this is not good. Now, physical threat is perhaps the most obvious. Dragons are a great example of that. They are mighty, they are strong. Their threat is that they cause injury and death, or severe discomfort and significant burns. But consider the other credible threats. Military threats are very key. Think about Dr. Doom. It's a great example. Did somebody just whisper? Just thinking Dr. Doom. As well, you should always be thinking about Dr. Doom, because he is always thinking about you. Welcome. So Dr. Doom, why does Dr. Doom get away all the time? Diplomatic immunity. What's that?
Because Doom Guy wasn't there to stop him.
Because Doom Guy wasn't there to stop him. Man, Doom Guy really is a solution to all problems. But yeah, and so like, why won't the American military just like, why doesn't America say, well, we don't care if you have diplomatic immunity because Latveria is full of giant robots. They're like, all right, fine. But military threat's very significant. Lex Luthor, another example of, actually Lex Luthor, depending on which Lex Luthor you choose, may be any of these. But yeah, military threats. If you've got a sci-fi setting, someone who shows up with an alien armada, like, well, yeah, that's a pretty significant threat, even if they themselves are not that big a deal. Emperor Palpatine is just some old guy on a chair until he shows up with 16 Death Stars. I mean, Star Destroyers. Well, Death Stars. Those things only take like half an hour to make, right? Like, every time you turn around, you're like, oh, that's... Jupiter's got twice as many moons. That's no moon. Economic threats. Economic threats are more subtle, but there's something horrific about an enemy who can just buy you out. Oh, I just heard people go, ugh. Yes, every corporate takeover, like any cyberpunk setting, where would a cyberpunk setting even be without its massive corporations? I'm trying to remember, I had a game a long time ago, it was a vampire game, and somebody was like, oh, well, I'm gonna mess with this guy, and then the guy turned around and just bought everything. Just bought his house, bought the company that he worked for, and just was like, yeah, no, I just own all that stuff, and you're out of everything. And they were like, I thought he was gonna fight me. And I was like, he did, you lost. Economic threats, what makes Batman such a superhero? Yeah. Not even trauma. Trauma and money, oh, what a combination. Not a single person said willpower, and good for you. It's money. He's not a good, not the right kind of green. Yeah. Yes?
The Shinra Electric Power Company has three of those. Three of those in one.
Sounds like there's a lot of agreement. Yeah, and indeed, many of these overlap. And in fact, if you have one, you're probably well on your way to getting another. Especially if you start with economic power, because then you just, well, if I'm going to be a giant corporation, I might as well hire my own private military. Political power, of course, very powerful. The ability to move, I suppose it could be nations themselves, but even things like political favors. It's very hard to defeat a villain when they are elected president. Lex Luthor returns again. Which was one of my favorite things. Superman shows up and it's like, oh, you're the president, and I'm so American. And ideological threat. Ideological threats themselves are pretty good. What?
Like Stain from My Hero Academia.
Like Stain from My Hero Academia, exactly. I was going to say like the Cold War.
I was thinking more along the line of what about something that can control people's minds?
Mind control. That's not on my list. Indeed, this is not a complete list. I really should have put and more. But mind control, that sort of power, and indeed, mind control is basically your gateway to any of the rest of these. Because if you have mind control power, then you can just find somebody with any of these powers, and then now they're yours. But indeed, ideological. I was thinking, Steven Universe works almost entirely on ideological threats, both for and against. Indeed, you could argue that they're all just about the ideological concepts, and some power. Yes.
Could the threat just be charisma?
Sure. Someone who's just they're so likable. And then what usually follows is that then they're an ideological threat because, Far Cry, the 5, 3, any of them, 6 of them. Foss. Yeah, it's just like, oh, you should hang out with me because I'm so cool. And then suddenly it's like, and what would be really cool if you rob that bank? Yes. The Architect from The Matrix 2. I don't remember there being more than one Matrix movie. But if that were true, I think you'd be right. Yes?
I was going to say, with the political, Game of Thrones, especially House of the Dragon, is an excellent study in, like, the undercurrent of political power and how someone who's down here can turn kingdoms.
Yeah, absolutely. The House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, for anyone who didn't hear. Yes, fantastic. And so these are all extremely credible threats. If you're playing a game of Vampire the Masquerade, or whatever they're calling it these days, political is perhaps the strongest one. I was just running a game, and the characters were, they're good old vampire characters with their fangs and whatever. Vampires. But yeah, they found themselves kind of like hip deep in all of this political intrigue because it's a vampire game, and that's kind of how it goes. And indeed, many of the people that they're afraid of, they're not afraid of, purely because of their physical force or whatever, but it's because they themselves represent large groups that have taken it upon themselves to keep those people in power. And so they know messing with this person means you're really messing with all of those people. You mess with this person and suddenly you're out of the group and you can't rely on any of that stuff. So political power is very subtle, but it's very present. Yes?
Could a villain be like a group of people perpetuating an idea of someone who no longer exists?
Yes. Yes. And I suppose you could argue, like, well, is it one villain or many villains? But really, it doesn't matter. Yeah, absolutely. So your villain would be the villain group. And so you have, like, a cult, or you have I don't know a better word than cult for that. But yes, in which case the credible threat is the group, and their motivation is that they are continuing the works of this presumably now dead person. But of course, where would any villain be without panache? That elan, that presentation. Megamind, if you haven't seen it.
Yes. Thank you.
Mwah. Chef's kiss.
So good.
I don't normally put video clips in my presentations because I don't like to rely on them. But I've always considered you're a villain, but you're not a super one. Well, what's the difference? Presentation. And indeed, a personal MO is what villains really need. Now, you could argue, well, you can do villainous stuff without an MO. And I'm like, yeah, but who cares? You didn't show up here so that you could listen to me talk about how bad guys can do bad guy stuff. There's a little section in the back of the DM's guide for that. But they need a personal MO. They need that panache. The villains that we remember, we don't remember because of their villainy per se. We remember them because of how they did it, how they went through with it, what they considered to be important, what they considered to be worth crossing these social mores for. Now, the personal MO could be something as simple as a perspective. It could be something that they have. Maybe it's that ideological perspective, and we're fascinated by it. Or it's that guiding light. What good would BioShock be without Andrew Ryan? I mean, I played most of BioShock because I just wanted to hear Andrew Ryan keep saying things that made me want to say, "You idiot." I went through sociology class. But it was there. He had that charismatic sort of like, is not a man entitled to the sweat of his brow. No, says Washington. No, says Moscow or wherever. Moscow or whatever, Mike, really? But yeah, and so it's that perspective. It's that idea that it's like, oh yes, we're gonna hold up this Randian philosophy sort of a thing, even though it's clearly killing us. So I'm like going through the game, and I'm sure many people who played BioShock, that's what drove them onward, was that. Because after a while, it does get kind of tiring shooting people underwater. Yeah, you didn't think you'd hear that today. That's my hot take. Sometimes it gets boring shooting people underwater. Yes, exactly. Which had another great ideological villain, which I won't get into spoilery stuff, but it's that whole kind of a thing. But it's that perspective. Even like to go back to the classical example of the Joker and the many variety of Jokers, the MO changes with every single Joker. The Mark Hamill 90s animated series Joker was more of a gangster sort of like with a goofy sort of a thing, and he really embraced the image of himself as the clown prince of crime. What?
Gangster showman.
Gangster showman. I thought you said gangster shaman, and I'm like, I'd watch that.
That's a different series.
Gangster shaman. I'm gonna start writing a script in an hour. That's gangster shaman. But gangster showman, exactly. And then
The villain of Crow.
what's that?
Pretty sure that's the villain of the Crow.
The villain of oh my God, you're right. It is the villain of The Crow. Also, thank you for bringing up a 90s example so I could know what was going on.
You're not the only 30-something here.
I'm not 30-something. But I really appreciate that. Oh my God. This is why I come to MAGFest, really. But yes, the villain from The Crow, yeah, he really is a gangster shaman now that you mention it. Wow, I haven't thought about that movie since 2002. That's not when it came out. That's just the last time I thought about it. But yeah, so you get that perspective, but you've got the Lego Joker who's just like, out for wacky fun because it's fun. But then you've got the Nicholson Joker who was an artist and he saw the world as like a fractured sort of mirror of the world. And so he wanted to show everyone how it could change. And then you have Heath Ledger's Joker who follows that ideological idea of like everyone is just one bad day away, which is sort of the Killing Joke style Joker. But every time, like, why did we watch The Dark Knight? Was it for Batman? Oh, I'm so sad. No, absolutely not. We showed up for Heath Ledger, showing up every line of Bon Mot. Like, I mean, that's why we show up, and that's why we love villains, right? Like, we want them to show up, and we want them to chew on that scenery so that they'll be picking out background for days. Don't quote me on that. That's terrible. But yeah, so it could be just that perspective. We just want to hear them say more stuff about their perspective. Or it could be one of those things where we really agree with their perspective, we just can't agree with their methods. You could also have an interesting power set. Sometimes what makes a villain interesting is just like they become that puzzle. How do we solve this? How do we solve the problem of someone who is indestructible? Maybe that's their thing. Maybe their whole power is just that they can't be killed, so they're free to do whatever they want. What's that? What if Superman were the villain? You'd have a god-awful movie called Brightburn. Yeah. And there was a game called Injustice.
Or a comic and an animated series called Invincible.
And yeah, actually, when Brightburn came out, by the way, if you haven't seen Brightburn, it is garbage. Not even like fun garbage, like it's just tiring. But yes, Invincible, a great example, what happens, you also get The Boys. Classic example, like how do you defeat someone who's undefeatable? Now that's even taking it to the extreme where you have someone who's undefeatable, can notice everything, has all of these amazing powers. Like how do you even begin to formulate that plan? But you could just have a power set that is perhaps just interesting. Maybe their power set goes against whatever the hero's powers specifically are. And sometimes it's just kind of like, let's just see how this plays out. I had a villain, this may be a little too niche even for, well, who am I kidding? You guys will probably correct me on this. But in 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons, yep, already seeing people nodding. Let me see if I can remember this. The Bracers of Ogre Might and the Girdle of Giant Strength do not stack with other strength boosting things except for each other. Yeah. Yeah, it's specifically mentioned and it's very strange. But it sure would be a shame if a mummy wore them both. Oh, go right ahead. His name was Thanatoxin and he was great. I know, right? I know. I could have given him a mustache for that. Like, just.
What do those two items do? I'm a 5e player.
Basically, they just gave him a truly outrageous strength, which also was multiplied by the fact that in 2nd edition, mummies had mummy rot and spells and great strength themselves. So he was just so overly superpowered. He could out arm wrestle storm giants. And he himself was more like he just kind of tore around, destroying things. You know how it is. You rise from the dead. You're cranky. You can't even drink coffee anymore. Need I go on? And the heroes who were two fighters, like they didn't have anything to do. Like they couldn't just go toe to toe with him. They weren't even in the position where they could just like try to tank the hits and whittle him down. So they had to like scavenge magical items. They had to get a little bit of this. They had to really get tactical and play off of his sort of. He was not the brightest bulb in the pack. So they had to outthink him. They had to outwit him. They had to like use every inch of the scenery to try to create traps that would just wear him down and distract him. It came down to a climactic battle of the heroes throwing a ring of regeneration back and forth as they were both just like dying constantly, trying to stop what was essentially a constant explosion of power. As the mummy just was out of spells and was just like smashing things left and right. It was dramatic. Feel free to steal that. That's fine. Of course, you'd have to update it to 5th edition. Or go back to your 2nd edition books, whichever. So sometimes it's just the power set that makes it interesting. And in this case, you can really use it to, especially if you've got a party of adventurers where it's like, wow, these guys just like cruise through everything. Well, what is it that would really mess up their day? What would really put a wrench in their cogs? Build the power set around that. Quirks. Everybody loves a quirky villain. Sometimes it doesn't even take something that's overly clever or overly unusual in terms of pure villainy. But if they're fun, they're just fun to have around. I already mentioned the Joker, Jinx. Nothing special about someone who throws bombs and uses guns, right? Like, those are pretty standard fare, but, you slap on some blue and purple outfit and a quirky voice. A lot of fun. Yeah. Vincent Price as Egghead. Is that a new Sonic movie? Oh, back in the 60s. Oh, my God. Yeah. I mean, really.
An egg-themed villain from Batman and 60s Batman.
Yeah. Oh, my God. Or King Tut. Condiment King.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. Yes. Condiment King. But, yeah, what a threat, right? Like, Condiment King. But, like, all right. They're just fun and interesting. Yes? Samuel L. Jackson from Kingsman. Yeah, great example. Samuel L. Jackson in anything, really. Yes. Thanos. Oh, Gladys. A very different one. Gladys. Actually, Gladys is one of my written examples. Yeah, absolutely. Like, sure, it's just a puzzle game, but then you have Gladys who makes the whole thing because you just want to hear her say stuff.
The original comic book Thanos.
The comic book Thanos, the one with...
Motivations were a little more interesting, we'll say.
I actually don't remember what his original ones were.
Death took an anthropomorphic form of a beautiful woman, and Thanos was trying to impress her.
Oh, that's right.
And she would have none of it.
Yeah, the whole thing was just like a really complicated, dating service. Yeah, I forgot about that. Like, I thought the anti-life equation was bonkers, but... All right. So, but having that personal MO really gives that personality, really makes them, the villain, somebody that the heroes, they just kind of want that villain to show up. Gives you as a GM a chance to kind of show in the scenery. It gives you a chance, may even give you just a chance to have fun. You deliver these bombastic lines or however you want to present it. But a personal MO is also very handy from a narrative standpoint because then the heroes, they don't have to rely on just like straightforward, like, oh, it's this villain. They can pick up the clues. A great example here, Spider-Man has a wide variety of villains. Batman has a wide variety of villains. The crime that's committed, you can kind of tell who it's going to be based on the crime. So it's like, oh, somebody, stormed into a bank and then grabbed the vault and left. It's like, well, that sounds like the Rhino because I don't think anyone else is going to pull that off. But, you show up and it's like, oh, nothing was missing except for someone broke into the bank and stole only $2 bills. Who could it be? I was trying to set up like some complicated Riddler thing, but I really should have gone with $2 bills. Well, I know when I've been upstaged. All right. So you're like, okay, so I got this idea for the power set, and I got an idea for like some quirky stuff, some kind of like interesting stuff, but to really get the heroes invested, the villains and heroes, they need some kind of a connection. Now, it doesn't have to be personal, though it could be like, oh my goodness, my good friend and buddy Butler turned out to be the villain. That's terrible, don't use that. Indeed, but the former associate does work pretty well, where it's like, oh my goodness, this person has turned on me. This is also a great chance. If you've ever had heroes, this is especially true of like Dungeons and Dragons and other kind of crunchy role-playing games where people sometimes forget that NPCs are people too. If you've ever had them like leave the torchbearer behind, or not pay the mercenaries, or use them as arrow fodder, if they survive, they are, or what?
Set their homes on fire.
Or set them on fire. It's like, It's like, oh, I cast Fireball. Are you sure your 3, NPCs are in the way? It's like, they're just NPCs. Yeah, sometimes they come back. They're like, don't you remember me? No, who are you? Oh, that's worse. You monsters. You can also pull stuff from heroes' backstories. So like if you've got someone, especially if you've got a player who they're like, all right, I worked out the backstory, and one person's like, I'm an elf from the forest, and another person's like, I'm a paladin for good, and then the next person is like, boom. Chapter 1. Part 1. Canto 1. Be wary of players who write in cantos. That's a literature joke, by the way, for anyone who's... So you can pull those kinds of things from the characters' backstories. Players who come up with those kinds of backstories, they love having that stuff integrated because it makes them feel like their story isn't just fanfic, but actually like a part of a living, breathing world. And it's a role-playing game, so why the heck not? Yes?
What would you say is the difference between villains and antagonistic rivals are?
Villains and what?
Antagonistic rivals.
Nothing. They're really the same. Villain here, even though I am mostly referring to villains who, twirl mustaches both metaphorically and literally, or people who are vicious and so forth. A rival is just as much a villain as any other villain. Here I'm really saying villain, I really mean antagonist. So indeed, if you wanted to make this... really, Mike, you can't think of a single rivalry? Belloc from Indiana Jones? What? Yes?
From Devil May Cry, the brothers Dante and Virgil.
Yes, Dante and Virgil. I suspect that actually took a significant departure from the poem, with which I'm a little bit more familiar.
Oh no, wait until you meet Trish, it gets worse.
Yes, of course, Trish, Dante's favorite character. Yes?
So, the connection I always claim the one that always has this is Cloud and Sephiroth.
Cloud and Sephiroth. Yes. So you can have like these rivals, and indeed, even though the rival probably isn't out for blood, although sometimes they are, these ideas still come together. Like your villains don't need to like kill people; they just need to provide that opposing force. Even if that opposing force, all they want is the power that the heroes are otherwise trying to get for themselves. Even if you had like a political race between two people, like each one is the villain of the other person's story, right? Because they're directly opposing. So as an antagonistic rival, these things still apply. You still want them to be a credible threat, even though it's probably not going to be physical. Even if it's as simple as their credible threat is that they can get to the relic before you can. And they're going to take it and sell it off because they're terrible, and you want it for a museum. Did that sufficiently answer your question? Okay. I wasn't sure. Sometimes I wander off from a question, so I forget. But yes, connections. So former associate, the foil, the idea, the mirror, the idea that the heroes are one thing, so then the villains are the opposite thing. Or they are almost the same, but for one difference. Batman villains, the classic Batman villains, very much great examples of this. You've got Two-Face, who represents the duality of the Batman and Bruce Wayne. You've got the Joker, who represents the one bad day snap sort of a thing, leads him to villainy, whereas Batman had the one bad day snap, led him to heroism, depending on who you are. The old Spider-Man villains? Spider-Man.
All genetically modified bases of some sort of animal, and they're all down the line really much.
Yes. Actually, you're right. I hadn't even really considered how many of Spider-Man's villains are also incredibly poor. But you're right, they are. With a few minor exceptions, yeah. You've got Norman Osborn, who ends up being kicked out of his... Actually, Norman Osborn depending on which Norman Osborn you have, he might actually still be pretty wealthy. But then you've certainly got Hobgoblin, who's just a mercenary. You've got Doc Ock, who's disgraced and often has to scrounge. He only steals so he can support his own research. You've got the Scorpion, who's used by J. Jonah Jameson. You've got, you're right. They all are just also people who are in an unfortunate position, poor, wearing spandex. And what about Kingpin? Kingpin, I think, would be more of the mirror in the sense that he's someone who's unpowered but extremely wealthy, as opposed to Peter Parker, who is powered but extremely poor. Not all of them fit a perfect dichotomy, unfortunately. But indeed, that sort of mirror idea. So if you're trying to think up like, oh, what can be like a really memorable big bad for my heroes, consider the heroes and take someone who's just like them but a little different, a little off, a little to the left, or a little to the right. And indeed, going back to the idea that villains don't have to be like monsters, evil types. Your villains can be themselves heroes, like actual legitimate heroes. If you have two countries that are fighting each other, which one is the evil one? Well, the one you're not in. And so your villain could be a paladin. It could be like a lawful good paladin. It's like, well, how are they the villain? Well, they are lawful good. So if what you're doing is illegal, they are obligated to oppose you on some level. And they may even be opposing you because the heroes just seem villainous. They just seem like they are up to no good, or they're not seeing the bigger picture, or something like that. So all of these things all come into these concepts of villainy and really make for a memorable villain, especially if the heroes can't rely on just a simple stabby stab and now they're dead. Which does solve a lot of problems, well, in role-playing games. I just remembered this is being recorded. In role-playing games, a little stabby stab solves a lot of problems. Speaking of stabby stab, personal attacks. If your villain, it doesn't seem like the heroes have enough of a personal connection, I suggest personally attacking the heroes. Now, I don't just mean like, sure, heroes and villains, they get in fights all the time, but let me give you an example. I was running a game of Dungeons & Dragons, and my heroes were pretty high level. They were getting to kind of like silly high level in their own way, because they just had piles of magical items. They just had they had all their spells worked out. They had the system down. And they were fighting some villains, and they were like, okay, they showed up, the villains are like, ha ha ha, I have the one ring or whatever it was I was doing. And it was like, but there wasn't like a real, like, we gotta stop these guys because we hate them. They're like, we gotta stop these guys because we're heroes and they're trying to take over the world, and that's like what we do. I was like, okay. Well, the thing about Dungeons & Dragons is that the spell list is available to everybody. The magical items list is available to everybody. And being a high-level villain is much like being a high-level hero in that you tend to have a lot of stuff with you. So, using some simple divination, the villains found out where the heroes were hiding out, which wasn't hard. It was in a big castle that practically had a sign saying, "Here we is." And so the villains just teleported in, destroyed a bunch of their magical items, shot them up a bunch with magic, and left. Your villains don't have to fight to the end, people. That's how they get away for next week's show.
Work is done.
Yeah.
You're off the clock.
Yep. And so, yeah, they popped in, they just broke a bunch of the magic stuff and popped out. You'd think I had personally punched each of my players in the face. Oh my God. They went from like, okay, so they'll show up here, wherever they show up, we'll just, we'll teleport in, we'll do this, this. Okay, no big deal. And then they were like, okay. They were like clearing the stuff off, and they're like, okay, we're gonna find where they are. I want them dead. I want their dogs dead. I want their family dead. It was like a mafia hit. It was just, oh my God. And all they did was pop in, just destroy some magical items.
What's the best way to motivate player characters? Have somebody steal something from them.
Yes. Have somebody. Oh, and the biggest complaint I got from that one was, how dare you do that, Mike? That's player tactics. I still remember that. That's player tactics. And I was like, yeah. They're smart too. They don't just hang around until you show up in their dungeon. That's right. Never forget to put the player back in non-player character. And indeed, some of you may have already seen my presentation on putting the player back in non-player character. And indeed, and that is what I think really makes a really solid villain. Once they have a motivation, once they have a modus operandi, they really have their own story, and that's what you need. That's what makes them so compelling. That's what makes us so interested in the villains. That's what makes us so fascinated when we have like the Joker show up. And that's why like in so many movies, like the hero is like, okay, yeah, you're a good guy, that's great, but Hans Gruber, That's the star of the show. You know, the villain shows up and just steals the show, steals the scene every time, right? I'm trying to remember, there was okay, this may be a bit obscure, but does anybody remember a movie called Virtuosity, starred Denzel Washington and a young, very young Russell Crowe? Russell Crowe played a character called Sid 6.7. He wore a purple suit and he was invincible. He was an amalgam. He was like a prototype android with all of the world's serial killers loaded into his head. Supposed to be used as a training program. Of course, he gets out. I know, right? Like, what could go wrong? Of course, we're going to use this training data in a way that's integratable with this new robot technology. Everything about that movie is extremely ordinary and bland, with the exception of Russell Crowe playing Sid 6.7. Because he just has fun. One, he's indestructible. Two, he has like this wide array of serial killer like bonanza going on in his head. And most importantly, he just steals every scene that he's in. Because poor Denzel Washington has to play a cop. With a robot arm. Ooh. Because it's the future. But then Sid comes in and he's just like, hey, how about this crazy perspective? Like, that doesn't make any sense. I know, but what about this? I'm going to do this. It's going to be fun. And we're all like, yeah. It's not great. But it is fun. And that's what you want your villains to be. You want them to be fun. You want your players to be happy when they show up because now there's a chance for the banter. There's a chance for the back and forth. Or they want them to be interesting in the way that like the Riddler can be interesting, where it doesn't feel like the GM is making a puzzle. It feels like this character is making a puzzle, which means that you can use that character, what you know of that character, to figure out your way through the puzzle, figure out the way through the idea. It's not like, oh, how does the GM think? It's, well, how does, I don't know, brainy lady think? Like, all right, well, brainy lady always goes for numerical puzzles, so there's got to be, if these are the clues, like if they stole a phone and they stole a pen, then it's like, okay, well, the pen is something this number and the phone has this number. That fell apart in the middle. Come up with a better one. But these are the things that bring us in. So yes, foremost, and of course he escaped again. There's something infuriating about a villain who gets away, which makes this an excellent time for me to plug my other presentation, which is tomorrow at 1:30, Building a Better Villain 2, Building a Better Recurring Villain, where I will focus on all of the things that make the long-term villainy work. But yeah, there's something about like especially if you've got a role-playing game where it's very much monster of the week, the villain gets away and it's like, ugh, now it's personal. All right, moving right along. Villains must be assailable. I often think of things in terms of either it's an antagonist or it's a force of nature. You might think of it as being an obstacle. Sometimes villains are obstacles. If your heroes are running through and they encounter a Balrog and they are not Gandalf, that Balrog isn't assailable. You have no way of fighting it. So even though it is a singular being, it's not really a villain. It's there to be avoided. The dragon shows up and it's like, well, we're all first level characters, so I don't think my rusty short sword and my, low-level boots of poor quality are going to help me against this thing. The hurl a rusty short sword at 10 times the speed of sound? That takes a lot of rules bending. Okay, if I cast haste on you like 16 times, and then you throw the short sword. No, haste only stacks duration. It does not stack speed. Playing the long game.
Camp outside.
There you go.
Watch him slowly die.
There's, and indeed, and certainly, and don't get me wrong, I certainly know that if you put something in front of heroes, especially role-playing game players, they will try to find a way. So it's like, so we're facing an unstoppable monster. Oh, that's a challenge. What's the monster made of? Pure light. Okay, well, particle light or wave light? It depends on which spells I use. But indeed, so like you may have, so you have villains. Force of nature villains, they also tend to be not specific groups. Like a horde of zombies is not a villain because it's a horde of zombies. They don't generally have some sort of like unified concept. So they're more of a force of nature. There are more things to be avoided. There are more things to be dealt with on their own terms. So they must be assailable. They can be mortal. They don't have to be. Your villains can be literally indestructible. They can be literally immortal. The gods in every single mythological story ever are great examples of that. Where they can't be killed, but they can be thwarted. They can be stopped. They can be opposed in some fashion. And indeed, they do not need to be killed. Your enemies, you don't need to kill them, which you may have to remind your players a number of times. And indeed, if you're going back to like My Little Pony, like what do? They don't knife their opponents. I'm pretty sure no one's like Fluttershy, quick, drop the bombs. You don't get that because it's just not part of the setting. But you can defeat opponents. You can prevent them from causing any further damage. You can turn them over with the power of friendship. Sometimes you can just straight up turn them into a statue or blast them with like a rainbow Care Bear stare or whatever. These things all work. And so defeat does not have to mean death, especially if they're recurring villains, because that's very convenient because then they can come back later. And it helps if villains have some kind of a killer. Yep, question? Celeste and Madeline?
Yeah, well, Madeline, for dark version.
I'm not familiar at all with.
It's a platformer video game, and your main character is named Madeline, and encounters a shadowy, dark version of yourself named Badeline.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's very clever. Yeah. Yes, indeed. Sorry. Oh, you know what? I was thinking of Coraline. Which again, villains that are not. They just need to be like stopped, really. But yes, and so they don't need to be killed, but it helps if they have an Achilles heel. Villains should have some kind of Achilles heel. Now, it doesn't have to be like kryptonite, or a literal Achilles heel. Your players will never believe that, by the way. If you're like, oh yeah, they have an Achilles heel, it'll be 30, 40 sessions before someone tries stabbing them in the heel. Or 5 minutes. There's no middle ground.
My players would.
Yeah, instantly like, oh, so we stab him in the heel? I was being metaphorical.
Very quick.
But some kind of Achilles heel. And everybody really does have that sort of weakness. If you're looking at, the Joker is, no, that's too broad a concept. Too many Jokers. But if you look at like the Lego Joker, his Achilles heel is that he just wants to be a part of things that are going on. He wants to be that opponent to Batman. He wants to have fun. So by removing the playtime with Batman, by removing the fun, suddenly defeated. Yeah, playtime with Batman. I'll go on record as saying that.
The Batman Beyond Joker didn't want to be laughed at.
The Batman Beyond Joker didn't want to be laughed at.
Ironic.
Yes. Very ironic. Nobody saw that coming.
Yeah.
And so it may be an Achilles heel where it actually is like something like, throwing this ring in a volcano is all it took. So it could be something like that, but it could be a psychological thing, just something that is always going to get them off track. It might be something like a very keen sense of honor where, the heroes can know, oh, they're not going to cross these lines because that is their particular code. Something like that. That can really make something go from being a seemingly invincible force to like, we have to figure out, what's the hole in the armor? What's the workaround here? All right, so we know what they need, but how do you come up with it all? Sometimes all you need is a cool name. Anybody remember City of Heroes?
Yes.
That's the way I remember it too. Like, yes, I heard that some servers were like privately coming up, and I'm like, don't tell me that. I need to live again. I have a job. I have people who need to see me on occasion. But I love just making characters for that game. In fact, for a superhero game that I ran, almost all of the villains came from City of Heroes, or specifically City of Villains, the villain side. My favorite was Lord Overkill. And I have to thank City of Heroes because I originally was like, I'm gonna make a villain and name them Overkill because that's pretty over the top. And it was like, Overkill is already taken. I'm like, oh, Lord Overkill is even more overkill. Fantastic, Lord Overkill. And then I built like the whole character concept. It's like, what if Dr. Doom was also into the occult? And yes, I know he got there. Sheesh. It had like this whole design set up. And so I was like, but all come from that one name, Lord Overkill. Another favorite villain of mine was Jurassic Jack. I wanted to make like a big beefy character, and so I went through a dozen names because of course it doesn't tell you that the name is taken until you get to the name thing, and then so forth. But I went through like a whole bunch of different other things, and I was like, Jurassic Jack, that sounds like a good old goon sort of, lieutenant-y bad guy sort of a name. Indeed, became a regular feature in my superhero games. So cool name. You want a name that the heroes can say, and it's also worth taking a moment to check to make sure that it cannot be easily changed into a stupid name. Something I have learned as a GM and as a teacher, always make sure that you cannot easily replace parts of the name with things like fart, or butt, or many other words. Depending on your players, you may have to go through an exhaustive list of words that you can't use.
Learn that the hard way. Stratfon Zarovich.
Stratfon Zar.
That's what they did.
Yep.
What they did.
Likewise, I still can't believe that J.R.R. Tolkien got away with Sauron and Saruman. I wouldn't have done that. I'd have gone with Sauron and Larry. They're easy to differentiate, you see. So cool. Devastating power set. I talked earlier about my character Thanatoxin, which was just a stupidly, that was a game-breaking set of things. But that all just came up because I was flipping through the magic items list, and I noticed that it's specified does stack with this one other item and nothing else. And I was like, well, I got to make those stack. I can't let that little loophole go. But it could just be, maybe you've got a character and you're like, oh, I want to see how my heroes deal with someone who has mind control, because they might take forever to even realize who the villain is. And it's like, why are all these people randomly attacking? And it's just like, oh, this guy in the background is always like, hello. I mean, maybe that's his quirk. He's just like, hello. Don't mind me. I'm just in the background. What a specific thing to say. So devastating power set. If you've got a group of heroes who are just they are seemingly unstoppable, but you notice that they don't have any psychic protection, well, then it's time for someone with some mental blasts to show up. Yes? 2-minute warning? Ooh. Campaign-based origin. Of course, if you've got a campaign setting, start pulling from those backgrounds. Maybe if you've got a D&D setting that is very, Lord of the Ringsy, then start pulling in from some of those background things you've mentioned, or from player suggested elements. Bring those in. Dramatic scene. Sometimes you're just what would be really cool is if there was a scene where there were 3 Jedi up on the high ridge, and then there were just a bunch of stormtroopers, and a dude just floating with a cape flapping, and giving a dramatic monologue, and then there's lightning everywhere. Now, how can I make that happen? And you work backwards from the cool scene. This is how most modern video games are made, which is why many of them are terrible. But the game that you make will be great. And the deal is that you take that dramatic scene, you work backwards, you create the thing that can make that scene happen, but don't force the scene. If it happens, fantastic. If not, you've got a cool villain, and it's going to that villain is going to make their own scenes. And of course, random generation, because where would role-playing games be without the math blocks, without the dice rolling across the table? I know second edition actually had a guide to villains, and in the back of the DM's guide, and in fact, still in the 5th edition one, there are random tables for things. Just start rolling them up. Discount the stuff you don't like. Try to make the stuff that is interesting work together. You can end up with some really interesting characters that way, because hey, they're randomly generated. You can fudge the numbers a little bit. No one's looking. Always fudge the numbers. Always fudge the numbers. All right. Well, with that, we come down to my thank you page. And yes? Oh, yes. I'm getting to that. So if you do want a copy of my slides, you can contact me at captainmike@captainmike.net. Please do put MAGFest in the subject line. Actually, I'm going to go just ahead to this one. Tomorrow, I've got a pretty light schedule this year. But tomorrow, I will be doing Building a Better Recurring Villain at 1:30 in the same place, where I will talk about what makes things go from just a single adventure to the ongoing campaign, major big bads, behind-the-scenes characters, all of those sorts of things. Plenty of more banter like we had today. And indeed, since I do seem to be right up against the clock, I am going to go ahead and say that if you do see me around the con, feel free to ask me questions at any time. But since I am running just short of time here, I will suffice to say thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed.